Okay, I'm going to do a short tutorial on how to set up OAuth in Postman. This is the tool I use for testing APIs before I write a script or an application to actually consume those APIs or use those APIs. Today I'm going to use a tool called Miro as the target REST API. Miro is a solution, cloud solution, which allows you to create like visualizations for things like mind maps and all these other things listed here. The reason I'm using this is because it was something I was doing a project on, and I was trying to build a Postman setup for the API. Also, if you want to follow along with this tutorial, it's actually free. So you can sign up to Miro. You can get the free platform. It includes all their developer features, which is really, really nice. So you don't have to pay any extra for that. And you get access to basically Miro, but in a limited form. So you can only create a few boards. I think you can only create a few apps and stuff like that. But it's a good place to get started. The REST API uses OAuth, so that's handy for this demo. And like I say, you can follow along for free. If you don't have Postman, then you can get Postman and download it. You will need to create an account for Postman. I'll put a link in the description on where to get Postman from, and I'll also include links for all of the reference materials for Miro, including where to go to sign up for a free account. Right, if you're hoping that this is going to be a straightforward, no documentation, click this, I'm sadly going to disappoint you, because the first thing we're going to do is look at the Miro documentation. What I wanted to do was, and this is normally the way I start with a project involving Postman or involving somebody's API, is I go and have a look at the reference documentation for the API to start with to see if I can get the information that I need. Miro's API is really nicely documented, and as you can see, it follows this kind of very standard format. You've got the URL that you need to call for the particular API, what type of call it is, and also, quite importantly, the scope we need. There's also some extra information about query parameters, etc., etc. But it's pretty standard for an API, and but it's a good place to start. The other thing, of course, we need to understand is the authorization mechanism for this. And as you can see, the authorization is right at the top of the documentation. If we click over, you can see that it's actually a standard OAuth authorization flow. And basically, you use OAuth to create a token, and then the token is used as a header to authorize each of the REST API calls that you want to make. So let's go back to this. I'm going to grab this and we're going to go through the initial steps for setting up Postman. But I want I want a initial API call to get myself started. So this is what Postman looks like when you first set it up. We've got nothing set up. I've actually created a new workspace for this tutorial so that we can see everything from scratch. You're going to need to set up two things in Postman. You're going to need to set up a collection, which is a list of all the APIs that you want to test. And you're also going to need to set up an environment, which contains all the environment variables that you're going to utilize as part of your API calls. That's one of the really nice features about Postman, is that once you set up an environment and enable it, you can use those environment variables in many parts of Postman. And we'll go through a few of those places where you can use the environment. It just makes the whole thing so much easier. Anyway, the first thing we're going to do is we need to create a collection. We can either click create collection, or we can do new collection here. And we're just going to do a blank collection. We're going to call it something useful like Miro maybe. and that will give us the basic container for setting up our API calls. Now what we want to do is add a request. We can do that through the add a request button, or we can go here and do add request. And we're going to call this get boards, and we're going to use this URL. You can see now that as soon as we've done this, it's starting to prompt us for authorization, because it knows we're going to need authorization, but we're going to come back to this shortly. The first thing we're going to do, though, is every API call from Miro uses the same URI to start the call. So we're actually going to convert this into an environment variable, so we can just use the same variable over and over again and not worry about having to type out the URL all the time. And we use environment variables for other things as well. So if we just highlight this and set as variable, so we're gonna grab this and we're going to cut that, and then we're going to go to environments and do add environment. We're going to call it Miro again. And then this is just a slightly more simple view with a list of variables. So the first one we're going to make is going to be called URI, and we're going to use that value that we copied from the API call. We're also going to, while we're here, we're going to also add a client underscore ID and client underscore secret, because we're going to need to come back to those. One important thing to do is to make sure that you save the environment. Every time you add a new variable or update the values, you need to make sure you save it so it's reflected in the rest of Miro. Now, along the top of Postman here, you can see that it's opened up a tab for everything that we might need to access. So we've got the collection here, we've got our API call, and we've got environment. So we just use these to flick backwards and forwards. You can obviously also go to the sidebar here and flick back to the collection that way. Let's go to the API call. And so instead of typing the URI here all the time, we're just going to do double curly brackets. No, we're not. Right. And that's something that always catches me out, is that you need to set the environment. So once you've created the environment, you need to configure the environment so that Postman will use it. And you do that in this top right drop down. We're going to choose Miro. And now we can use the double curly braces to fill in the things that we've set up in our environment. So we're just going to call double URI, and we're good to go. One of the things I would say is that I took the trailing slash as part of the variable. If you're not used to that and would rather see this format, just make sure your variable doesn't have the trailing forward slash in the variable. I like it like this. It just makes it so much simpler, and it saves you having to worry about trailing forward slashes. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is in fact need to look at the authorization. Rather than clicking on a shortcut, we'll go back to, we'll look at this API call first. And if we click on authorization, you can see it's inheriting auth from parent. What that means is it's going to take its authorization from the top level collection. We can get to the top level collection authorization from Miro by going to the collection and just clicking on authorization. Here we'll have the different types we can use. And there's loads of different ways you can set this up. It's pretty cool, but we're going to use OAuth 2. We're going to need to refer back to the documentation for Miro in a sec, but let's scroll down here and see what items that we need and fill in the ones that we already know. This section here is about the current token. We don't have a token yet, so we can scroll past that. We do need to configure a new token, so we're just going to give it a name. We're going to call it Miro token. We already know its authorization code type. That's actually a fairly standard process. There are several different grant types that you can use with OAuth 2. Authorization code is fairly standard, so we're going to stick with that. We'll confirm that in the documentation for Miro. The callback URL, this is quite important. And what we want to do here is the callback URL is something you would set up in your own application as a web address, and you would catch the callbacks from the authorization process in your application and process them there. But we don't really want to do that. So we're going to click on the authorize using browser. And what this will do is it will pop up an OAuth authorization page in the browser for us to approve or log in or whatever. We will need the callback URL at some point, so let's just grab that and copy it. Oh, whoops! I don't think I copied that right. Okay, now these are the fields we're going to need to fill in to get the OAuth authorization to work correctly. We need the auth URL. We'll have to find that from the documentation, and the access token URL. We'll also need that from the documentation. Client ID, if you recall, we set up a variable for client ID. So let's use the double braces syntax and fill in client ID, and the same, and the same for client secret. So that's that. Now the scope, we saw that from the documentation. If we just flick back and just double check the syntax, it's boards : read. So we could fill that in now. Anyway, okay, state. And then state is something that you would use as a developer to manage an additional level of confirmation about the OAuth process. We're just going to fill in something default here. I'm just going to use X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 2, 3. And then the client authentication, this is part of the second phase of an OAuth negotiation, and we need to check the documentation for this. There's two ways you can send it. You can send it as the basic auth header, or you can send client credentials in the body. Okay. Now, this section we're not going to need, but I'll just go through it for information, is sometimes with OAuth implementations, you need to provide additional information. So in our case, we will have the refresh token URL because we're going to create an application that needs to have the token refreshed. But you can also add additional parameters for the auth request, the token request, and the refresh request. And these things might be important in a more complex situation, and they would all be documented in the API. So all set up. We can't click on the get new access token yet because we need to fill in some of these fields. So let's flick back to the Miro documentation and see what we can find for that. So authorization. You need to set up access to the REST API in Miro. You do need to create an app, and you'll need to follow through these prerequisites to set up an app. We'll go through the stages of setting up an app. One of the interesting things about this is on this last stage, it will actually generate you a token and share that token with you. We're not going to use that in Postman because we want to be able to constantly go back to Postman and make sure we're refreshing our token and using the token from that we're going to set up in Postman. So the first phase of the OAuth is to create this authorization request link. And as you can see, it's quite a long, complicated URL with lots of parameters. One of the nice things about OAuth is this is a standard format. And so actually all we need to do is take this initial part of the URL, and we need to go back to Postman, and we need to put this into our auth URL. And then Postman will add all those parameters on as appropriate. So anything that we've got configured, like the client ID, for example, it will add that as a parameter automatically. So you don't need to worry about trying to generate the whole auth URL as specified in documentation. We also need the access token. So let's just go across here. Here we go. and slightly different format, this page, but you can see up here that this is the URL that we would use to get our token. So we just need to copy this and flick back over to Miro, and then we're all done. That's everything is done. One of the interesting things about Postman as well is it assumes the refresh token URL is the same as the access token URL. So let's just go and check that. Get new access token using refresh token. As you can see, it's exactly the same URL that we specified for the initial request for the access token. So that's all good. Let's just go back to Postman for a second. We're going to save this because everything is set up in here apart from actually getting the token. Now, the next stage is to create our app in Miro. And so to do that, we log into Miro. We go to our profile at the top right and choose settings. And then go to your apps. Nice and easy, create new app. If you don't have a dev team set up at this point, it will prompt you to create one. I've already got one, so that's good. We're just going to call this something like test REST API. And we're going to click on the expire user authorization token because that's a safe thing to do and something you would actually do if you were writing an application to contact this API. I'm going to create app. And as you can see, we have the client ID and the client secret. Unfortunately, I'm going to blur those out and I will negate them before I share this video. But we're going to need to copy these, right? So let's go back to Postman and we need to put those in the environment so they're available everywhere in our setup for Miro. So let's go back here and we need to grab this one and copy it in here. And we also need this one. And we need to copy that into here. And we need to make sure we save the environment so that's updated. Okay, now let's go back to the app setup. The app URL is required only for Web SDK apps. We're not doing that, so we don't need to worry about that. The redirect URI for OAuth 2, we need to fill this in, okay? And so we need to flick back to Postman. We need to go to the Miro collection and we need to find the section with the URL in. We need to copy this and we need to paste that in and we need to add it. We need to make sure we add it. You can have multiple redirect URIs for testing, etc. And so that's why you get the option to add multiple entries here. And so you need to make sure you remember to do the add, otherwise it's not completely committed to the application. Permissions, we want to keep this as minimal as possible. We don't want to give too many permissions. And so we're just going to do board to read. As you notice at the top here, Miro automatically saves these changes, so they're committed as you check on them. There are a few additional permissions. If you have the enterprise plan, we've only got the free plan, so we only have these scopes. Okay, and then there's some further information down here. We've also got our install app and get OAuth token button, which we'll need to do in a second. You can pick a particular board and you can also change the way that the app is presented. This is for publishing in the marketplace, so we didn't need to worry about that too much. So we need to make sure that the app has access to the right boards, and so we need to install the app and get OAuth token. We need to put it in a team, and I'm just going to choose the tutorials team here. and it tells us that we will allow the test REST API to read boards you have access to, and we're going to add that. Okay. As I mentioned, it actually gives you the access token and a refresh token at this point, but we're going to go back to Postman and generate our own. So we don't need to copy these. So we're just going to close that out, and they're lost now. So that's our app set up in Miro. As I said, we need to switch back to Postman now, and we need to try to get a token. So we filled in all our details. We have added the client ID and the client secret, which are important for the communication between us and Miro. And so we're going to try this get new access token, and we'll see the process that Postman takes you through to generate the token. It's going to take us to the browser, very same picture that we had just now when we added the app to the team. We're going to click Tutorials Team. This will allow Test REST API to read boards you have access to, same as we had before, and we're going to add again. Okay, interesting. So at this stage, Postman wasn't able to finish the negotiation with Miro to generate a token. Let's do what it suggests and have a look at the console. This is a really cool troubleshooting tool in Postman, which basically breaks down all of the calls that it made in quite a level of detail. You can access the console. If you just close it here, you can always access the console from the bottom left. We're going to expand this. The initial call to, the secondary call to generate the token is a post, and you can see the request headers here. It's, lots of authorization stuff, etc., etc. What we want to see is the response body. So the response body's here, and this is the error we're getting. There is no password encoder mapped for the ID. Okay, that's really not very helpful. What you can do here is you can double check that there are things that are presented to the API correctly. So for example, we know that our authorization header needs to be basic, and it needs to contain some details. So that looks like it's been sent properly. And we can check that the URL that we've used is correct as well. And so that all looks good. So that's a bit of a conundrum. Let's go and have a look at the documentation for the second part of the exchange, which is the exchange authorization code with access token. And let's see what it requires. If we check up here, it's nothing too complicated. We've got the correct URI, and if we look down here, we've got the query parameters, all pretty straightforward. It needs the client ID, the code, and the redirect URI. But I didn't see any of those in the URI. Or we could have the body parameters, client ID, and client secret. Okay. Let's go back to Postman. So let's just try the client authentication. One of the things I would say is let's just go back to this documentation. Note that the client secret is not passed in the query parameters. It's only passed in the body parameters. And so I wonder if that's why Postman's struggling. So let's send the client credentials in the body rather than in as headers. We need to save this before we can run it again. And let's get new access token. Same process as before, choose a team, add again. And this time it worked. Brilliant. So that was an interesting error. The debugging we had wasn't very helpful, but at least we've worked out what was going on. We've read some documentation, and we've kind of made an informed decision on what to change. Postman then gives you the token, all its details, and what you want to do with them, and you need to click on the use token before it will actually add that token to its authorization. And if we scroll back up, you can see the current token's now been filled in. Final step. We should now be able to go back to our API call that we're making. So we're just going to try and get boards, send this. And great, it's worked. It's come back with a 200. It's listed out all the boards that I've got access to with all their associated bits and pieces. There should just be a couple, right? And that's got it working. So that's how, that's a good example of how you set up OAuth with Postman. It works really, really well. Previous to this, you really struggled with setting up OAuth, and you maybe had to go and create a separate app or something, generate the token, and then paste the token into Postman. But with this OAuth configuration now, it's really straightforward. Once you've picked through all the bits and pieces you need to set up, which hopefully I've gone through in this tutorial, it's actually quite straightforward to set it up. I hope you like the video. If you do, please give me a like. If you have any questions, or there are other APIs that you'd like me to try and set up OAuth to and do a demo, then please stick them in the comments. Thanks very much for watching.